along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Lebanon looks small, almost like a thin brushstroke between sea and mountains. But this is a land where the horizon changes faster than the heartbeat salty air and sunlit beaches below, and not far away ridgelines that can turn white with winter. In the same frame, ancient harbors whisper of ships that once stitched continents together, while cedar groves scarred, protected and stubborn stand like living flags on the high slopes. How can so much world fit into such a narrow space? And when mountains and empires keep shifting the ground beneath it, what does it mean for a country to endure? Lebanon's landscape feels like it was folded in a hurry, sea pressed against stone pushed into sky. That sensation is not an illusion. The country sits in a restless corner of the Levant, where the ground has spent millennia being squeezed, lifted, cracked, and reshaped. Two long mountain spines, Mount Lebanon to the west and the Anti-Lebanon Range to the east, run roughly parallel to the coast, like twin walls guarding a narrow corridor of history. Between them lies the Bekaa Valley, a high elongated basin that looks calm from afar, yet reads like a seam in the earth's fabric. The mountains are more than scenery. They act like climate machines. Moist Mediterranean air arrives heavy with salt, and water then rises as it hits the western slopes. The lift cools, it wrings it out, and paints winter snow across the high ridgelines. In clear weather, the snow line can look like a second shoreline, an inland coast of white. But on the far side of those peaks, the air descends warmer and drier into the Bekaa, creating a rain shadow effect that makes this valley feel sharper, browner, and more continental than the coast. In a short drive, the world changes from humid sea breeze to crisp mountain air to sun-baked interior, a geographic time lapse that never stops running. Water traces the same story in moving ink. Short rivers rush from the highlands toward the sea, carving steep valleys and gorges that echo with wind. Other waterways take longer, stranger routes. The Litani River, for example, threads through the interior before bending its way toward the Mediterranean, while the Orontes Nahr al-Asi flows northward, an almost rebellious direction in a region where so many rivers hurry to the sea. Each river valley becomes a corridor for farms, towns, and roads, because in Lebanon, habitable space often appears where the land has already been cut open. Then there is the stone itself, limestone, that has been slowly hollowed by water, forming karst landscapes, sinkholes, and caves. This is the kind of geology that feels a live rock that dissolves, collapses, reforms, a hidden architecture beneath the visible one. In places like Jeddah, the underground becomes a cathedral of mineral-time stalactites and stalagmites, growing by droplets, patient as centuries. Above ground, the same limestone creates terraces, cliffs, and pale ridges that catch the afternoon light like bone. The mountains also store temperature like memory. Summer heat can cling to Beirut's coastal streets, while only a short distance away, the high country breathes cooler air through pine and cedar. Winter brings a different drama. Storms roll in from the Mediterranean clouds, snag on the peaks, and snow seals off villages, turning roads into lifelines. Even in modern Lebanon, weather can still decide which places remain connected and which places become islands. This natural stage helps explain why Lebanon's human map looks the way it does. The coast has always been a ribbon of access ports, trade arrival. The mountains have always been a shelter and a barrier refuge during conflict isolation, during storms, and a keeper of older rhythms. The Bekaa has long been a granary and a crossroads, a place where caravans, armies, and merchants could move through a corridor that feels both protected and exposed. Yet the country's beauty carries a quiet warning. This is a land shaped by motion, and motion can be gentle or violent. The Levant sits near major fault systems, and throughout history, earthquakes have not been rare visitors. That knowledge lingers in old masonry, in the way certain ruins look as if they were interrupted mid-sentence. Even the grand stones of ancient temples stacked with confidence that seems almost supernatural hint at a deeper truth. Humans build here with the awareness that the earth can revise everything. In this compressed geography, seasons arrive like characters entering a scene. Spring spreads green across valleys and terraces, briefly softening the edges. Summer hardens the light and deepens the contrast between coast and interior. Autumn turns the mountains into a slower palette gold rust gray, before winter returns with snow and silence. The result is a country that never holds one face for long. Lebanon is a place of transitions between sea and summit, wet and dry soft soil, and hard rock modern streets and ancient foundations. And if the land itself is built on layers, limestone caves beneath villages, fault lines beneath highways, snow above olive groves, then every journey across Lebanon becomes more than travel. It becomes a passage across systems that depend on balance water and stone heat, an elevation shelter, and exposure. So the question that opens the door to everything else is simple and unsettling. If Lebanon's ground and climate are always negotiating with forces larger than any one generation, how did life here learn to negotiate back? In a country, this compact nature does not unfold slowly. It changes in quick vertical steps. Along the coast, the air tastes of salt and algae, and the vegetation leans into the Mediterranean rhythm. Hardy shrubs, aromatic herbs, and trees that have learned to endure long, bright summers with little rain. Inland and upward, the palette shifts. Hillsides grow darker with pine and oak. Higher still, the wind cools, the light sharpens, and the land begins to resemble a different latitude, one where winter can hold on, and where the most famous tree of Lebanon survives like a relic from a deeper past. The cedar is often treated as a symbol, but in ecological terms, it is also a witness. Cedars thrive in cold mountainous conditions, and they live on a timeline humans can barely imagine. Their branches stretch wide, their trunks thicken slowly, and their presence turns a slope into something almost ceremonial. Walking beneath them, the air feels heavier with resin and silence. The ground is usually sparse, needles, stones, pockets of soil, because in the high country, abundance is measured differently. Not by how lush the forest is, but by how long it has managed to remain. Yet Lebanon's forests are not only cedar. Pine woodlands, oak stands, and mixed mountain forests form a mosaic that follows elevation exposure and rainfall. On sunnier slopes, drought-tolerant species dominate. In shaded valleys and north-facing ridges, moisture stays longer, allowing different plants to hold their ground. This patchwork creates countless microhabitats, small ecological rooms, where insects, reptiles, birds, and mammals each find a niche. In spring, the land becomes almost noisy with life. Wildflowers push through thin soil on rocky terraces. Bees and butterflies work the hillsides with a precision that feels ancient. The scent of thyme and sage rises when the sun warms the ground, and in the distance, birds stitch the air with calls that seem to bounce between mountain walls. Along streams, reeds and willows soften the edges of stone, and wherever water lingers, the landscape suddenly looks less like a cliff and more like a cradle. Lebanon's location also gives it a quiet ecological importance beyond its size. It sits on a corridor between continents near a major route used by migratory birds moving between Eurasia and Africa. That means the sky above Lebanon can become a passageway, especially during seasonal transitions. Some birds stop to rest and feed, turning wetlands and coastal edges into temporary sanctuaries. Others pass overhead, like living weather formations reshaping in the wind. For a viewer, it can feel almost unreal. One moment, the hills look still, and the next, the air is in motion, with travelers that belong to two different worlds. The sea is part of this biodiversity story, too. The Mediterranean off Lebanon's coast may look calm, but it holds its own network of live fish, crustaceans, seabirds, and at times marine mammals moving along the shoreline. Coastal habitats, beaches, rocky coves, and near-shore waters become the borderlands where human development and wild systems collide most visibly. On certain stretches, the coast can still support fragile nesting grounds and feeding areas, but these are the first places to shrink when cities expand and lights burn brighter at night. In the mountains, the conflict takes a different form. Here, biodiversity depends on continuity forests that remain connected slopes that are not sliced into smaller fragments, water sources that keep flowing. But Lebanon's terrain encourages sharp boundaries, villages perched on ridges, roads cutting across valleys, fields stepping down hillsides and terraces. Where humans carve the land to survive, nature adapts until it reaches a limit. Forest fires, for example, can rewrite entire slopes in a single season. Overgrazing can thin vegetation and expose soil to erosion. And the loss of old-growth stands is not only the loss of trees, it is the loss of shade, moisture, retention nesting sites, and the slow ecological stability that mature forests create. Still, life persists in surprising ways. Wild boar move through scrub and forest edges, turning over soil in search of roots and insects. Foxes and jackals can appear at the margins of towns, opportunistic and intelligent, taking advantage of whatever the landscape offers. In more remote areas, the signs of larger predators and shy species may be scarce, but the ecosystem still carries their memory tracks in soft earth, a sudden silence in the underbrush, a tension in the behavior of prey animals. Even when an animal is not seen, its absence shapes the story of the place. Lebanon has also created pockets of protection nature reserves that function like ecological lifeboats. Some shelter cedar forests on high slopes. Others protect mountain biodiversity and rare plant communities. A few defend coastal ecosystems that would otherwise be swallowed by development. These protected spaces are more than scenic backdrops. They are experiments in balance how to keep wild systems alive while people continue to live, work, and move through the same narrow geography. But biodiversity is not only a catalog of species, it is a sensory experience. It is the temperature shift when a road climbs into shadowed pine forest. It is the sound of wind changing pitch as it moves from open ridge to sheltered valley. It is the way a landscape smells different after rain, wet stone, crushed leaf soil that suddenly releases its hidden minerals. It is the color of the water in a mountain stream, clear and cold compared with the warmer, heavier air near the coast. Lebanon's nature does not ask to be admired from a distance. It changes the body's perception with every kilometer. And yet, the more vivid the diversity, the more fragile the system can be. Climate pressure threatens snow patterns and water availability in the mountains. Hotter summers intensify drought and fire risk. Urban growth eats away at coastal habitats. Pollution and over-extraction can strain rivers and wetlands. Overhunting, especially of migratory birds, can turn a natural corridor into a dangerous gauntlet. In a country where ecological zones are compressed, damage spreads quickly. A change in one layer water forest cover temperature echoes into the others. This is why Lebanon's biodiversity feels like a metaphor as much as a scientific fact. It is a living proof that complexity can exist in tight spaces, but only if the threads remain connected. The cedar needs cold, stable highlands. Wetlands need clean water and room to breathe. The coast needs darkness and quiet in the right seasons. The migratory sky needs safe pauses along the way. So the question becomes sharper. In a place where nature is stacked like pages in a single thin book, sea forest, snow valley, what happens when even one page is torn out? And if Lebanon's wildlife has learned to survive in fragments, how did humans across centuries learn to survive here too? Before Lebanon was a modern state, before it was even Lebanon, in any political sense, it was already a meeting point. A thin strip of coast facing a generous sea. A wall of mountains rising fast behind it. and a high valley, tucked between ranges, offering passage farmland and distance from the shoreline. Geography did not merely host human life here, it trained it. The earliest traces of people in this region reach back into deep prehistory, when small communities learned to read the seasons like a script, when the rains would come, when the rivers would swell, when the hills would turn green enough to support grazing. Over time, settlement patterns became a dialogue with altitude. Coastal plains offered fish trade routes and fertile pockets. The mountains offered springs, timber, and defensible high ground. The inland valley offered space to grow grain and move goods across the land's narrow corridor. Even in those early rhythms, Lebanon's landscape encouraged two types of intelligence. One was maritime, an instinct for horizons, navigation, weather, and exchange. The other was mountain-born, an instinct for shelter, endurance, and the patient knowledge of slopes, where to plant, where to store water, where to build, so the wind would not steal the roof in winter. Along the coast, life gradually organized around harbors and anchorages. The sea was not simply a boundary, it was a road. It invited movement, and movement invited ideas. Long before large empires tightened their grip, the coastline cities and towns learned that survival could come not only from what the land produced, but from what the sea connected. In that world, a boat was more than transportation. It was an extension of the city's lungs, bringing in grain metals, timber dyes, stories, and strangers. This is the shoreline that later becomes associated with the Phoenician city-states places like Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre communities that grew into sophisticated nodes of craft commerce and seafaring culture. Their identity was rarely one of a single unified kingdom. It was more like a necklace independent beads linked by the same sea, the same mountain backdrop, and a shared sense that water could be turned into power. Their ships did not just carry goods, they carried reputation. And in the ancient Mediterranean, reputation could travel faster than armies. If the coast shaped people into navigators, the mountains shaped them into keepers. In the highlands, survival meant learning the language of scarcity. Thin soil, sharp winters, and roads that could vanish under snow or rockfall. Communities here often leaned on terrace agriculture, turning steep slopes into stacked steps of life. Stone walls held back erosion. Small orchards and groves clung to elevations where the temperature was kinder to certain crops. Springs were guarded like secrets, because water in the mountains can feel like a promise that must be protected. This contrast, coast as openness, mountains as refuge, became a long-running pattern. In periods of stability, the coast flourished with exchange and urban culture. In periods of danger, the mountains could become a shelter, a place where groups protected their language, their rituals, their way of life. This is not a simple story of city versus village. It is a story of how the same people could become different versions of themselves depending on elevation and threat. Lebanon's early cultural fabric was therefore layered like its geology. Beliefs and practices did not develop in isolation. They developed in contact with inland caravans, with coastal traders, with neighboring kingdoms, and with faraway ports that felt close because the sea made them reachable. Religious life, so often tied to landscape in the ancient world, reflected this contact. Coastal settlements might honor deities connected to storms, navigation, and fertility. Mountain communities might hold tighter to sacred springs, forests, and high places that felt closer to the sky. The land provided symbols, and people turned those symbols into stories that explained both beauty and danger. And then there is the cedar, again and again, because in Lebanon's early human story, the cedar is not only ecology, it becomes material and meaning. Timber from the high forests was valuable precisely because it was not easily replaced. Straight, strong, fragrant wood is a kind of wealth when stone is heavy and metals must be imported. Forests become strategic. Mountains become resource vaults. And when a resource becomes famous, it also becomes vulnerable. Yet, it would be a mistake to imagine early people here only as extractors. They were also inventors of balance. When settlements depend on terraces, on seasonal rains, on forests that protect slopes from erosion, the environment is not a background, it is a partner. The most successful communities are often those that treat the land as a system cutting wood, but not destroying the watershed. Planting, but not stripping the hills bare. Hunting, but not exhausting the migration routes. On the coast, this systemic thinking expressed itself through craft and communication. Ancient Levantine societies are often remembered for trade, but trade requires more than ships. It requires contracts, measures records, and a shared way to label the world. Over centuries, different writing traditions and scripts circulated through the region, and the broader Phoenician legacy is frequently linked to how alphabetic writing spread across the Mediterranean world. Whether through merchant scribes or the simple necessity of keeping track of goods, writing became a technology of survival, an invisible infrastructure beneath visible prosperity. Byblos, in particular, sits in the imagination, like a hinge between material and memory, a city whose layers speak of long habitation, where the past is not behind glass, but underfoot. In places like this, early culture does not feel like a single era. It feels like stacked time streets, built over older streets, shrines rebuilt over older sacred ground generations, leaving marks that later generations may not fully understand, but still inherit. But culture is not only what survives in stone, it is also what survives in gesture. Food traditions, shaped by Mediterranean climate olive oil grains, wine-preserved herbs, carry the logic of seasons. Music and oral storytelling carry the logic of community how to teach the young without books, how to keep identity during change, how to interpret a landscape that can be generous one year and harsh the next. And always, the mountains keep their own tempo. Even when coastal cities grow rich, the uplands can remain quieter, older in rhythm. This difference creates a tension that becomes deeply Lebanese across time, a sense of being pulled between cosmopolitan openness and inward endurance, between the world's attention and the necessity of retreat. So when the region later enters the orbit of larger empires, when outside powers bring new languages, gods, armies, taxes, and roads, Lebanon's early cultural foundations help explain why it remains complex rather than uniform. The coast can adapt quickly because it is built on exchange. The mountains can resist or preserve because they are built on refuge. The valley can feed and connect because it is built on passage. All of these roles are born early, long before modern borders. They are the product of the terrain's personality. And that leads to the question that matters most for the next chapter. If Lebanon's earliest communities learned to survive by becoming both open and protected, both outward-facing and inward-rooted, what happens when explorers, empires, and resource booms arrive with promises too large for such a narrow land to hold? Lebanon's history does not move in a straight line. It moves like a coastline, curving interrupted, returning to the sea again and again. The reason is simple. The Mediterranean was never just scenery here. It was leverage. It turned small harbors into gateways, and gateways into names that traveled farther than the land itself. Along this shore, the Phoenician city-states mastered a particular kind of power, one built on navigation craft and exchange rather than farmland empires. They were not famous because they held vast territories inland, but because their ships could stitch together a web of ports across the Mediterranean. Timber from mountain forests, glasswork metal goods, and the legendary purple dye associated with Tyre produced from sea snails, and labor became part of an economy where prestige could be worn, carried, and displayed. The sea turned local materials into global symbols, and symbols into influence. Yet maritime success always came with a price: visibility. A coast that thrives on trade also attracts conquerors. Over centuries outside, powers arrived in waves, some as merchants, some as administrators, some as armies. The coastline cities learned to adapt quickly changing languages of power without entirely surrendering their own. The mountains, meanwhile, kept their slower tempo, becoming refuge during upheaval and preserving identities that the coast could not always protect. Inland, another kind of monumentality grew: stone rising out of a valley that feels almost too open, too exposed to be sacred. Baalbek is where Lebanon's historical scale suddenly shifts. The sanctuary complex expanded under Roman rule, projects a confidence that borders on the unreal colossal platforms, immense blocks and temples whose surviving columns still stand like a challenge to gravity. It is not only architecture, it is messaging. Empires did not build like this merely for beauty. They built to announce permanence in a landscape that reminded everyone how quickly power can change. And Lebanon did change hands many times. Routes linking the coast to the interior mattered not only for trade, but for control. Whoever governed these corridors could tax movement, protect caravans, or exploit them. Roads and passes became strategic. So did water sources. So did ports. The result was a land where history often arrived as infrastructure, new fortifications, new administrative centers, new religious buildings, new systems for collecting wealth. If Roman stone spoke the language of empire, the medieval period spoke the language of fortification. Castles, citadels, and coastal strongholds rose at key points, watching harbors and hills. The shoreline that once welcomed sailors became a frontier line, sometimes defended, sometimes contested, often rebuilt. Cities like Tripoli and Sidon carry this layered memory in their very silhouettes. Old walls, sea-facing defenses, and dense urban cores that grew around the logic of protection. This is also where Lebanon's geography again shaped the human story. In mountainous areas, communities could retreat, regroup, and maintain traditions through periods of instability. In coastal zones, cosmopolitan life continued, but it did so with a heightened awareness of vulnerability. The sea could bring prosperity, yet it could also bring fleets. The mountains could isolate, yet they could also save. Over time, Lebanon became a place where different historical eras did not replace one another cleanly. They stacked. A sacred site could be repurposed, expanded, reframed. A town could shift from maritime trade to regional administration, from craft production to military outpost, and then back again. Even the vocabulary of the land changed. Phoenician legacies braided into Greco-Roman influences, then into Byzantine and early Islamic periods, then into medieval and Ottoman layers. The country's identity became less like a single narrative and more like a palimpsest older text, still visible beneath the new. And then came the age when global economics began to remake the region with quieter tools than conquest, contracts, concessions, commodities, and credit. In the 19th century, Mount Lebanon experienced a boom tied to silk production. Mulberry trees and silkworms turned certain mountain districts into nodes of an industry connected to distant markets. It sounded like opportunity, and for some, it was. But it also reshaped land use, and labor fields that once prioritized subsistence crops could be redirected. Households could be pulled into new forms of work. Debt and dependency could grow alongside profit. When a mountain economy shifts toward export, it can gain wealth and lose resilience at the same time. This is where development begins to look like a double-edged blade. A country so compressed geographically is also compressed economically. Changes ripple quickly. When global demand rises, valleys and villages transform. When demand falls, the same places can be left exposed. And because Lebanon's terrain is already a negotiation between coast and mountain, wet and dry, open and protected, economic upheaval becomes another force that the land must absorb. Infrastructure followed these shifts, and with it, the tempo of life accelerated. The Beirut-Damascus Railway, inaugurated in the late 19th century, is one of the clearest symbols of this change. Iron tracks, forcing a new kind of connection across difficult mountains, binding the port to inland markets more tightly than caravans ever could. Railways do more than move goods. They move priorities. They draw some towns into prosperity and leave others on the margins. They recenter geography around speed. Beirut, in this era, becomes a powerful emblem of Lebanon's historical arc. It is not simply a city. It is a hinge between worlds, Mediterranean-facing, yet deeply tied to inland roots, modern in its commerce, yet standing on older foundations. Its neighborhoods carry the logic of layers. Streets that feel contemporary can sit near traces of older epochs, as if the city is constantly negotiating what to preserve and what to rebuild. Ports create that mentality. Everything arrives. Everything departs. Identity becomes something that must be maintained amid constant influx. But Lebanon's development story never fully abandons the mountains. The highlands continue to supply not only water and timber, but also cultural endurance. Villages remain tied to seasonal rhythms, to terrace agriculture, to family networks, and local traditions that can outlast political structures. Even when cities grow, the mountains remain psychologically close, a reminder that retreat is possible, that shelter exists, that another Lebanon is always waiting above the coastal noise. Seen as a whole, Lebanon's historical development can be read as a series of negotiations with scale. How does a small place handle large forces, empires, religions, global markets without losing its own coherence? Sometimes it adapts and thrives. Sometimes it fractures. Sometimes it holds different truths in different elevations. And that is the bridge into the modern age. Because the same qualities that made Lebanon extraordinary, its crossroads, position its layered identity, its compressed geography, also make it sensitive to shocks. A port can magnify prosperity, but it can also magnify crisis. A mountain refuge can preserve culture, but it can also become isolated. A corridor valley can connect worlds, but it can also become a pressure line. So the next question is unavoidable when modern pressures arrive. Economic strain, environmental stress, urban expansion, and the struggle to protect heritage, while people simply try to live what parts of Lebanon's ancient balance can still hold. In the modern age, Lebanon still looks like a country, built from contrasts, sea and summit, old stone, and neon prayer, and traffic, cedar silence, and coastal noise. But the contrast has sharpened. What used to feel like a poetic tension now often feels like a daily negotiation with pressure. Beirut is the most visible stage of that negotiation. It is a city that has repeatedly rebuilt itself, sometimes by choice, sometimes by necessity, layers of architecture and memory overlapping in a way that can feel both resilient and exhausted. Along the Corniche, the Mediterranean still carries that illusion of calm, a horizon that does not argue waves that keep their rhythm no matter what happens on land. Yet only a few streets inward, Lebanon's modern story reveals its weight: economic uncertainty, power struggles, and the relentless question of how a society keeps functioning when stability becomes rare. One of Lebanon's defining modern challenges is how quickly crisis can move through a small, interconnected space. When the economy suffers, the shock does not stay confined to bank offices and government buildings. It travels into kitchens, pharmacies, classrooms, and fuel lines. Inflation becomes a lived environment. Savings turn into ghosts. Daily routines are forced to reorganize around scarcity electricity that comes and goes, supplies that become unpredictable, and the quiet stress of planning life without reliable ground beneath it. But modern life in Lebanon is not only a story of shortage, it is also a story of improvisation of communities building informal systems when formal systems weaken. Neighborhoods learn to share resources. Families adapt work schedules to changing conditions. Small businesses survive through creativity and stubbornness, turning limitation into invention. In many places, resilience is not a slogan. It is a method. Environmental pressure adds another layer to this tension. Lebanon's ecosystems, already compressed into narrow bands, are sensitive to climate shifts, water stress, and land use change. Hotter summers and altered rainfall patterns can intensify drought, raising the risk of forest fires in mountain regions. When fires burn through woodlands, the damage is not only scenic. It is structural roots that held soil in place are gone, increasing erosion and the risk of landslides during heavy rains. Watersheds lose their protective cover. Springs weaken. And in a country where villages often depend on local water sources, an ecological shift can become an immediate human problem. Coastal development creates a different kind of environmental strain. The shoreline is valuable real estate, which means wild coastal habitats are often the first to shrink. Light pollution disrupts nocturnal patterns. Pollution degrades nearshore water. Fishing pressure can stress marine life. Even the aesthetic of the coast changes: more concrete, fewer quiet spaces, where land meets sea in a natural way. The Mediterranean remains, but the conditions for life along its edge become tighter. Then there is the cedar, again still standing, as symbol still threatened as ecosystem. Modern conservation efforts treat cedar groves as treasures that must be guarded not only from logging, but from fire pests and climate stress. In protected reserves, the cedar becomes a focal point for an entire philosophy that heritage is not only stone temples and old cities, but living landscapes that require long-term care. Cultural heritage, meanwhile, lives in a complicated relationship with modern instability. Lebanon's UNESCO sites, places like Byblos, Tyre, Baalbek, and the Kadisha Valley with the Forest of the Cedars, represent a world-scale importance compressed into a few hours' drive. But protecting heritage is never only about fencing off ruins. It is about maintaining the social and economic conditions that allow preservation to be more than a luxury. Tourism embodies this tension perfectly. Lebanon has the ingredients for an extraordinary travel experience: mountains, beaches, archaeological wonders, vibrant food culture, and cities that pulse with nightlife and art. In stable times, tourism can provide income and a sense of connection to the wider world. But in unstable times, tourism becomes fragile, subject to headlines, regional tensions, and the practical realities of infrastructure. When visitors hesitate, livelihoods shrink. When visitors return, pressure rises again, sometimes without adequate management. Lebanon must constantly balance between needing tourism and protecting what tourism comes to see. And still, daily life produces culture with stubborn beauty. Food remains a language of continuity. Olive oil, herbs, bread, grilled meats, preserved vegetables, sweets, scented with rose and orange blossom recipes that carry the memory of seasons and family gatherings. Music and poetry remain central to identity, from traditional forms to modern scenes that blend Arab, Mediterranean, and global influences. Art galleries, street murals, and independent films often function like public diaries, recording how people feel when official narratives fail to explain the lived reality. In the mountains, village life can still follow older patterns, especially where agriculture remains viable. Terraces, orchards, and seasonal harvests continue even if they are now shaped by market pressures and climate uncertainty. Festivals, religious, cultural, and local, create moments when community reasserts itself, reminding people that identity is not only defined by crisis, but by continuity. So modern Lebanon is not a single mood. It is a collage: grief and celebration collapse, and creativity, fatigue, and humor, fear, and pride. It is the sound of generators in the background of ordinary conversation, and the sound of laughter that refuses to disappear. It is a place where the past is not distant, because it is everywhere, under streets, inside museums, in names, in food, in the silhouette of ruins against sunset. And that leads to the final question. When a land holds so many layers, geology, ecology, ancient city-states, empires, modern upheaval, what does it ask of those who witness it? Not just tourists with cameras, but viewers who may never set foot here. If Lebanon is a lesson written in stone and cedar and sea wind, what exactly is the lesson? Lebanon is often described as small, but small is only a measurement of area. It does not measure density of meaning. Here, the Mediterranean does not simply touch the land it shapes. It feeds it, tempts it outward. The mountains do not simply rise, they divide. Climates protect refugees and carry winter into the same country that serves summer by the sea. And between them, valleys and corridors hold the quiet truth that life survives by adapting again and again to whatever the terrain demands. This is why Lebanon feels like a documentary in motion. Every kilometer changes the light. Every ridge changes the wind. Every ruin insists that time is not a straight road, but a layered stone staircase, one step built on another, each generation, adding weight, removing pieces, rebuilding the same foundations with new hands. But the most human lesson is also the most fragile. Endurance is not automatic. Cedar forests can shrink. Rivers can weaken. Coastlines can harden into concrete. Heritage can crack, not only from earthquakes and weather, but from neglect and exhaustion. Modern pressures, economic strain, environmental stress, and the struggle to keep daily life stable can make even ancient places feel temporary. And yet Lebanon's story also shows what people do when stability is rare. They improvise. They protect what they can. They create culture as a way to breathe. They keep cooking, singing, rebuilding, teaching, and telling stories, sometimes as celebration, sometimes as resistance, often as both at once. So what can a distant viewer do with a place like this? Start by seeing Lebanon as more than a headline. Learn the names behind the scenery: Byblos, Tyre Baalbek, the Kadisha Valley, the cedar groves in the high country, and understand that each is part of a living system, not a museum frozen in time. When travel is possible, choose it responsibly. Support local businesses, respect protected landscapes, and treat heritage sites as shared inheritance rather than entertainment. When travel is not possible, support the idea of preservation through education, through sharing truthful stories, through valuing culture that survives in difficult conditions. On a map, the edge of the world can look like a border. In Lebanon, it feels like something else, a place where sea and mountain compress history into a narrow frame, forcing one enduring question to linger. If a country can hold so much beauty, fracture memory, and reinvention, what does it ask us to protect in our own corner of the world?